I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know more people will be joining us as we go. We have a little schedule on the screen, and I'm going to switch that out momentarily to show you something else. But I want to welcome you and let you know how very glad we are that you are here. And I know a lot of people are going to join, so how about we give people, Michelle turned to Jim. Hi, Jim. Well, let's wait a couple more minutes and give people a chance to come on. But I will reiterate that you can raise your hand if you want to participate in the Q&A when we get there. And or you can simply put your questions onto chat, and they will be read very carefully and articulately by Roger Wapner, who is here at my side helping out. And it's great to see the number of people expanding as it goes. And please do leave yourself on mute until you're called upon to answer or to have your question responded to. So when we do get around to questions, I'll remind you, but please do say your name and your town so we know where you're from, and then bring your question. And everybody's coming on. Yay, David, thank you for being here. And Joanne and Monica, how fun to have so many people showing up for this event. And it is being recorded. You're going to be recorded. It will be put up on YouTube, so people will be able to access it readily. And in fact, if you want to see one of the past town halls, 2 of them are recorded and they're on YouTube under Valley Women's Club Environmental Town Hall, and it'll pop up and you can find it that way. So let's go ahead and get started. More people will be coming, but I think we need to officially get going because Mark only has a couple of hours for us, and we're absolutely thrilled he has that much time for us. First, I want to welcome you all. We're glad you're here. We're going to keep a schedule up for a while just so folks will see it when they come on, and you'll have a sense of how much time things will be taking. And again, it's very flexible. So thank you for coming. And we are so lucky that we could be doing this on Zoom. Otherwise, it would be postponed for another year. That's why this is the almost annual 21st Environmental Town Hall. The 21st would have been in 2020, and we missed that completely. And now this is supposed to be 2021, but we made it by 2022. So thank you for dealing with Zoom so that we didn't have to wait any longer. I want you to know that I'm sitting in the Felton Library because my Wi-Fi is not capable of doing a Zoom in this way and reliably. So, and with me at my side is Roger Wapner, who's going to be helping with the chats, reading them aloud. And I also have the president of the Valley Women's Club, Allison Andrews, is in this room along with Bracken Andrews, who is a very active and important member of both the Environmental Committee and the PG&E subcommittee. So we are, you're well represented here by a bunch of people who really care about what's going on. And I see Monica's here. Yay, Beverly, thank you for coming. All right, so as always, it's a beautiful day in the San Lorenzo Valley. It's probably prettier than we wish right now. We'd rather have rain. We all cherish the fact we live here, and we want to welcome you to the 21st almost annual Environmental Town Hall presented by the Valley Women's Club's Environmental Committee for the San Lorenzo Valley. We all can be grateful that we live in an area where our state assembly member is truly happy to come speak to us on environmental issues and many other issues when called upon. So we're grateful that Mark could be here today. We hope you'll be able to take what you learned today and apply it to your lives and share it with your friends and neighbors, that it will be interesting and useful, and that to remind you, you are being recorded, and we will have that information available soon so that it can be shared with others. There is a lot to learn. I'm going to take a minute to provide you with a look at the new listing of the wonderful I have to stop this share. I have to do a new share. Here we go. And hold on, I got to switch to the other thing. I'm going to share it. There we go. Oh, it's not, it's failing. Let me try again. I don't know how to do that. It'll disappear. All right, well, you know, it's just not that important. I'm not going to worry about it. All right, I was going to try to show you a wonderful brochure that we've created. You know, the town hall in the past, when it was in person, around the room was filled with other agencies and organizations and environmental groups, and we couldn't do that today. So we have put it together into a brochure. It's available now online on the Valley Women's Club website, and it's the environmental organizations and agencies providing resources for San Lorenzo Valley and Santa Cruz County residents and businesses. It's great. It's got their name, their website, people to contact, and what they do. So I hope you will all take advantage of checking that out when you have the opportunity. So we're going to quick go on now, and apologies for those of you who are coming on. I want to remind you, it is being recorded. And the brochure, of course, is free to all, and we will have hard copies of it available at various events in the future. And guess what? Speaking of upcoming events, you need to know the good news. The Environmental Committee is going to have a booth at the Redwood Mountain Fair. The fair is coming back. It will take place Saturday, June 4th and Sunday, June 5th at Roaring Camp. It's in the planning, and there will be an amazing lineup of music, artists and artisans, children's activities, delicious food, beverages, and it's an all volunteer event. And because of that, the money goes to benefit local organizations, school groups, and nonprofits. So spread the word and put that on your calendar for the first weekend in June. All right, one other thing, you are invited to join the Valley Women's Club if you're not already a member. All are welcome. There are memberships for individuals and families, students and seniors, as well as businesses and nonprofit organizations. The VWC does a lot. Did you know that we provide generous scholarships to a couple of SLV high school students who are going to go to Cabrillo, $500 and $1,000 to get them going in school. You may not be aware that along with the Environmental Committee, there's an Active Women's Issues Committee, as well as an Education Committee. In addition, we have special programs such as the SLV Habitat Restoration Program and the San Lorenzo River Estuary Project, which is another restoration program down at the mouth of the river. The Caregiver Support Group is helping people who are being caregivers to a family member or someone in their home. And we have other advocacy projects like the PG&E subcommittee, which is very busy, and the Butterfly Project. So, and plus we have events like the Isadora Dance Workshop. Oh my God, Isadora Duncan Dance Workshop. It was wonderful, and it's going to return. We have our annual general membership meeting, which is usually a lot of fun, and the scholarship rummage sale, which helps benefit that scholarship I mentioned. And coming on September 17th, put it on your calendar, the River and Road Cleanup. So there's plenty going on, and you can find out more about the Valley Women's Club at valleywomensclub.org and on Facebook. And it's women's plural club, and we can't leave the men out. You know, they're too important. So because we're Zooming, there are a few things to go over. First, the Zoom is being recorded, so it can be made available. A lot of people called about it or emailed about it saying, I can't come. How do I get to see it? Well, it's being recorded, so it will be available. And our State Assemblymember Mark Stone will be speaking shortly. And when he is finished with his remarks, you may raise your hand or write in chat with a question. Whether spoken or written, you're requested to give your name and your town. And if you write it, please add your email. In fact, I'm suggesting that you put your question in the chat in case we run out of time and not everybody's question gets to be responded to. If you put your question in chat and it isn't, and you have your hand up, but we don't get to call on you, add your email, and Mark will be able to, and his wonderful staff will be able to work on getting the answers to your questions to you. So that's your name, your town, and your email in the questions on chat. So this is amazing how lucky we are to have so many people who care about this precious part of the Santa Cruz Coastal Mountains, and now to the heart of the program, and heart in every sense of the word. Most of you are well aware that we have an effective and knowledgeable leader in the State Assembly. Mark Stone is responsive and concerned about the San Lorenzo Valley. He pays attention to our concerns. He's always been ready to delve into some of the most complex and far-reaching of the financial and social and environmental issues facing our state. To top it off, he has an experienced, thoughtful, and dedicated staff to provide additional support. Mark lives in Scotts Valley, and he first served us for 2 terms as our 5th district supervisor. He did such a great job locally and was highly responsive to the San Lorenzo Valley, and that led to his leadership and to his election in the State Assembly in 2012, where he has demonstrated his leadership in many areas. In fact, here's the list, you guys. Mark is currently chair of the Judiciary Committee. He's a member of several other standing committees, including Banking and Finance, Budget, Human Services, and Natural Resources. He's on the Budget Subcommittee number 5 on Public Safety. So he gets to help worry about how we're going to fund things related to public safety. He's on several select committees, where he is chair of the Select Committee on Coastal Protection and Access to Natural Resources. To top it off, he's vice chair of the Joint Committee on Fisheries and Aquaculture. Mark, do all assembly members have so many committees? Obviously, Mark has innumerable commitments throughout his district and many demands on his time. And happily, he's very good at what he does. And so he makes time to listen and support the SLV. He keeps us in mind when working on legislation in Sacramento. Thanks for coming, Mark. We're turning it over to you. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Nancy. Happy to be here. And it'll be interesting doing this in this format. And I'm glad you're recording it, but just it's a bit daunting to think of being a talking head for 45 minutes. So I've got some prepared remarks that I want to go through. I also, Nancy gave me a slew of questions to try and delve into. So I'll try and delve into those because I know those are going to be at the heart of a number of questions that you'll be asking. And sometimes we have some good answers and sometimes not, just sort of depending on the issue, the situation and all. And if the state government worked a little bit more like local government, sometimes it'd be a little easier to get things done. Sacramento can be very frustrating, a lot of moving pieces, lots of varied interests that come out in different ways. And what seems like common sense, sort of straightforward policy can often be difficult. But I want to start actually globally, because I had the opportunity to go to Glasgow, the COP26, which is a conference of parties, the 26th meeting. And the parties are all the parties to the original Paris Accords a number of years ago, having to do with climate. And it was very interesting to be a part of the discussions and see how far we've come, but also rather frustrating in the lack of specificity, lack of detail, lack of real action. In fact, the group of national leaders, the G8, whoever they're called, they met a couple of weeks prior to COP26 having started, and what they were supposed to have done was address the issue globally around coal and come to some agreements for getting rid of our international reliance on coal. They never really did reach agreement. And it's interesting to listen to the perspectives of the various countries around the world, and especially the developing countries who do rely on coal, and very large ones, China, India, whose position is we didn't cause this to begin with, so we shouldn't be having to take the brunt of it now, which is an interesting argument. And yes, there's truth to that. And there are a lot of countries who, also being smaller, don't have the resources to make some of the shifts necessary to address to mitigate climate emissions and to address the impacts of what's happening around the globe. And I think a lot of the first world countries need to take some responsibility for that. But it's also frustrating to see countries just show an unwillingness to participate and take responsibility for what their role is. And we had some very interesting meetings along this line, one of which I will mention was with Australia, representatives of the federal government. We met with both subnational jurisdictions, which think of as states, so although we were in Scotland, and Scotland itself is a nation and has its own parliament, but is also subject to Westminster. So they are, in this context, a subnational jurisdiction. And there's was deemed the under 2 coalition, and that's to keep the climate warming under 2% or under 2 degrees Celsius. And that's an old concept, because we now know it needs to be 1.5 or even less, because we're pretty quickly approaching that number. But the subnational jurisdictions have taken a real leadership role and have been able to get things done that a lot of federal governments haven't been able to do, given the politics. And the cases in Australia is a case in point. We met with folks from the state of South Australia who have taken some pretty aggressive stance on climate. And part of it is they do, and they're very vocal about this, want to shame their federal government into changing some of their attitudes and perspectives and policies with respect to climate change. So the subnational jurisdictions, like California is doing, are trying to push their federal partners, federal governments, into doing a little bit better. And Australia itself has some fairly aggressive goals, but they also have a real reliance on the economics around coal. And at the same time as they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and taking some of that fairly seriously, they make a lot of money selling coal to other nations. And so it seems to me to really present a dichotomy when a country has aggressive goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the fossil fuel usage, but yet still facilitating that fossil fuel usage in other countries rather than helping them out. They're also wanting to be, I think, the second largest exporter of hydrogen, and hydrogen can be a good renewable fuel that is carbon free, but it all depends on how hydrogen is made. And most of their hydrogen right now is being made by generation, or being made from coal, from the energy generated from coal. So that's not necessarily the clean hydrogen that we want to see on the global market. And Australia is pretty unapologetic about that perspective. And when we challenged them on that dichotomy, they didn't seem to see it as a dichotomy, because they want to move their economy forward, but are not necessarily willing to take steps necessary to clean, green their economy, at least from that standpoint. And these are some of the artifacts where you have subnational jurisdictions that are a little bit more progressive and willing to take some harder steps, and national jurisdictions that are less progressive and really unwilling to take some of the steps necessary. So COP26 overall, and if you follow, which you should, Greta Thunberg, who is a real strong voice for the youth moving forward. And she had this button that was going around, and she was pretty vocal about it. They just said, blah, blah, blah. The blah, blah, blah was a reference to all the talk and really no action. And even California suffers from that. A lot of the policies that move forward are aspirational and don't really address some of the needs or some of the changes that need to happen in policy in order to drive sort of where we're going in the future. So that part was pretty frustrating. In the end, the agreement around coal was to just reduce reliance on coal and not set any timelines for stopping the use of coal. Now, California's moved away from coal, and a lot of other jurisdictions have. We met with the subnational jurisdiction Baden-Württemberg, which is a German state essentially, and again, being fairly aggressive around transportation and around other policies to try and reduce, to be a real leader in Germany in reduction of reliance on dirtier technologies and pushing for their goals. But here's one of the biggest challenges, and this started to come out and be talked about at this COP, and I think it's been ignored in a lot of previous ones. In Western economies, 90% of the money is privately held, and only about 10% is publicly held. And yet it is the governments that everyone is looking to, and that's the whole point of COP. Governments that everyone is looking to come up with the money for solutions for moving forward. And governments just don't have that money and are not going to have that kind of money. Governments can set policy, governments can create incentives, and there are various things that governments can do. And typically the way governments can drive economies or drive changes in choices in industry is through its ability to tax. And if there was a willingness to tax carbon, then governments could do a better job of incentivizing decisions being made by industry to create greener products, greener processes, greener technologies. Those would then have the incentives necessary. And that taxation could also then be turned back around and invested in areas where the investments need to happen to help. Even so, if the state of California were to do that, for example, one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in the future are the counties and the cities who just do not have and will not have the resources to address a lot of the changes that are coming down. We're trying to change how in California, we're trying to look at not just mitigation, but adaptation. And adaptation is very expensive. And the state's not going to have the money to be able to build that resilience into everything that it does, especially with respect to counties and cities with local jurisdictions who certainly are not going to have that help. And so with the state, if the state can help to a point, but only has a certain number of resources, a certain amount of resources really to be able to do that. Now, I say that knowing that our budget this year and last year has been pretty flush with cash, but the demands on that budget are significant. Every day almost I have meetings with people who have great proposals that want to spend $1 billion here and $1 billion there. And pretty soon a lot of that money then ultimately gets dried up. And as the economy changes, that money is not necessarily going to be available in perpetuity. So we're looking at investments we can make now and ways that we can do investments to really help with some of the resilience needs that the state is looking at. So COP26 was rather frustrating in the lack of action or really the lack of some direction. But one thing that gave me some hope was this was the first conference of parties where the financial industry was there and in force. And as our discussions with Australia, and this is sort of how the effect of the financial industry works, is the financial industry, of course, is going to be backing the public projects that people come up with. And when Australia is looking to develop more capacity to produce hydrogen, they're finding already that projects that are not focused on green hydrogen, that are not forward-looking, don't get financed as easily as ones that are really trying to find better solutions. So the financial industry is starting to pay attention. Now, will that bring around changes quickly enough to keep us under the 1.5? I don't think so. We're really headed for a crisis and headed there quickly. And some of these institutions have been very slow to come to the table and slow to be a part of the solutions we really need them to be. But they were there, and it's the first time they were there. So that does give me some hope that some of the components now are coming together in ways that they hadn't before. But we'll have to see what changes we really have. Now in California, we have the cap and trade program, which unfortunately, in my view, is really not working very well. It could be set up to provide some of those incentives and raise money. And it does raise money, but not very much ultimately. Raise money for investment in some additional kind of climate beneficial projects as we're moving away. But we haven't really been able to focus some of those monies. For example, investments in organic farming and working lands and even in natural lands have been difficult to try and incentivize and even get in the conversation. A lot of cap and trade dollars are driven by policies out of the California Air Resources Board. And they've come to the table pretty late, recognizing the value of investing in the carbon benefits of good soils management, good forest management, good wetlands management, and this notion of blue carbon, if you will, which is managing wetlands and coastal areas, estuaries, and others in ways that are climate beneficial. And those are expensive, but they had not been favored. And we've been trying to push, some of us have been trying to push a lot harder at making those kinds of projects more acceptable within the framework of cap and trade. The other part about cap and trade that I objected to is that there are too many giveaways in it and too many opportunities for industries to just pay to pollute and not have to then change the original notion of cap and trade were declining benefits to those industries so that they would be needing to find different technologies, better ways of doing whatever it is that they do that were more beneficial to the climate. And because of either the free allowances or the allowances that industry can buy into, we're not seeing those shifts. And even though we are getting money out of the cap and trade system, it's not money that we've been able to, and because of a lot of frankly, the side deals that were done, a lot of that money is going back into the industries, which is not always bad if they are incentives for better behavior, but not productive ultimately for us meeting our ultimate climate goals. So those are some of the challenges that I see on the climate basis. And again, the legislature now, members came back and they're all geared up to introduce legislation, but a lot of legislation over the last number of years to me has just been aspirational and not without enough teeth in it to be able to really drive the changes and quickly that we're ultimately going to need. And the speaker at COP26 was pretty blunt about it. And you all know the speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, he is the elected leader of our body, but he was very clear that California is not really leading on climate anymore. We talk a lot about it, but when we look at actual implementation, we do come up a little bit short. And it's difficult to get with especially kind of the biggest foe in this is the oil industry. And the oil industry has a tremendous amount of clout in the legislature. And we've been trying to do some small things like improving air quality around oil wells, stopping some destructive practices that the oil industry is getting into, creating setbacks where there are oil wells. And you can see, and even from an environmental justice standpoint, these are things that should be easier to do than they are. The people are often surprised to learn that there are oil wells in Beverly Hills, like there are in Los Angeles, because people don't see them in Beverly Hills. They are indoors, under wraps. They have good air quality management practices around them because Beverly Hills won't put up with those emissions. They're set back from residences and businesses and schools and other places, unlike the poor areas of Los Angeles, where those wells are right adjacent to schools and adjacent to property and adjacent to businesses. And as we've been trying to push the oil industry to increase setbacks and take more responsibility for air emissions, those have not been favorably adopted throughout the legislature. Unfortunately, we've had some very difficult bills die. And so even as we talk, the implementation is becoming more and more difficult. Now, also on the state level, I said, and a lot of the work that I do around environmental is attached to the Ocean Protection Council. and the kind of working in the coastal environment and with the oceans. And the OPC it's not a regulatory agency. It's been set up as an advisory body essentially. But we came out with a pretty aggressive strategic plan a couple of years ago and have been working under that. And one of the interesting things that OPC has done is working with a lot of the other state agencies like Parks and Caltrans and Fish and Wildlife and any other agency that needs to be a part of or has an impact on ocean quality or water quality. We got a lot of buy-in from those state agencies to look to OPC to set some standards and best practices and get those agencies to follow the strategic plan of what the Ocean Protection Council set out. So from the state standpoint, we have been able to create kind of an overarching set of policies or set of directions under which state agencies will be operating. And even though Ocean Protection Council doesn't have the ability to do that, it does fund various projects and it does provide scientific advice or technical assistance to a lot of these other agencies. Getting the agencies to look at what is OPC's strategic plan and implement their projects, whatever it is they're working on, that particular agency is working on, through the lens of that strategic plan, I think is really very, very significant. The science arm to OPC is the Ocean Sciences Trust. And that is a trust of a number of scientists and academics around the state. And one of the things that we found is that they could also be providing that technical assistance and that supportive scientific role, but their charter is very, very limited. So frankly, one of the things I'm doing this year is trying to expand that charter to make them available. Department of Insurance, for example, has been asking for some help because as they're looking at vulnerabilities along coastal areas, I mean, they're looking at vulnerabilities with respect to wildfires, but also on coastal areas, flooding and sea level rise and in a number of the kind of changes that we know that we're starting to see. They need that scientific help. So we're trying to get all of the various components of state government on the same page and working cooperatively within their areas of responsibility, and then utilizing the climate expertise and the knowledge of some of these other agencies in order to provide some benefit. So, and that kind of what I'm working on this year from an environmental standpoint is also microplastics. And microplastics has been difficult to make much headway on in the legislature. In fact, I had a bill a couple of years ago that died in the Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee, frustratingly. And it was because the science is, and I think most of us understand what the science is going to start to show or has been starting to show. But until the science is there, it sometimes is difficult to move policy. And the chair of that committee wanted to wait for the OPC report. Well, the OPC report is out now. And it is showing the need for us to even now start taking some actions on stopping microfibers from getting into the various water treatment systems, the various systems we have in the open environment to the extent that we can. So we're going to take another shot at trying to deal with microplastics in the environment, especially as they're coming out of washing machines, dryers, and through mechanisms on our day-to-day operations, especially with the fleeces, polyester fabrics, a lot of things that are part of our clothing these days. Those break down in washing machines and in dryers and end up going out into the environment. And it is alarming the amount of microplastics that we are finding in drinking water, in bottled water, in fish and other animals that are interacting with microplastics. And another bill that I'm not actually author, I'm a joint author on it this year, but providing expertise. So we're taking another run, a different author, if you will, is taking another run at getting rid of cigarette butts in our community. I'm very happy about that. The science, when I first I've now introduced that bill 3 times. This is now the 4th time. And each time it wasn't taken very seriously within the legislature, even though the science was very, very clear about it. But that's another example of plastics getting into the environment in a very destructive way. And the biggest hurdle we had was this notion that if we take the filters off of cigarettes, we're making it a more dangerous product. But the science all shows that that's just not true at all. So from a scientific standpoint, the cigarette filters provide no benefit to the smoker, but real detriment in the environment. So we're going to continue to work on that. So those are some of the environmental things that I've been working on in the legislature. And again, a lot of it's through the Ocean Protection Council and trying to set those standards. And I'm really proud of the leadership there at OPC in having this vision to create this bigger picture set of policies and guidance for other agencies. And I'm a little surprised, I guess, at the willingness of other agencies to agree and to follow along and to start to set some of their processes around where we're going. And then with bringing the science to bear with the Ocean Science Trust and with what Ocean Protection Council provide, we're starting to see some real benefit in policymaking. And that's always been a bit of a struggle. Not all policymakers, as you well know, believe in science or are willing to agree to science-based policymaking, especially when it goes against other interests that they feel that they're being responsible to. All right, so I want to shift now to some of the questions and address them. And I know that PG&E is a really big issue, and it's a huge issue in the legislature. And some of the questions that Nancy forwarded me was what can we do, good Lord, and sort of what are some of the standards. And this is, I will admit, has been fairly difficult. When the first wildfires, or several years ago, we had some of these enormous wildfires that were caused by PG&E, and PG&E having made business decisions to not adequately ensure their operations against wildfire and some of the damage that ensued, they were financially in very difficult straits. So what did they do? They came to the legislature to bail them out. And the legislature was very tempted to do that in a lot of ways. And I think and it was a very ill-advised movement. And they, not only to bail them out financially, but there was a big push by PG&E to absolve them of future liability, change the liability question, because they are a quasi-public agency. And so they do have some kinds of liability that are similar to what a municipal utility would have. And fortunately, the issues of liability are something that comes through my committee, the Judiciary Committee. And so I was able to be a part of those conversations and kind of squash those before it got too far along, because PG&E wanted to have the full benefits of being quasi-public, in that they are able to go out and get cheap money and do the investments that they want to do, but they didn't want the attendant liability. And can't have it both ways. You either are or you are not, but they wanted to kind of further hybridize and get some benefit for that. So the willingness of the legislature to listen to them and want to help them out, for me, was a little bit alarming, because we've been working with, I hate to say with, PG&E, or dealing with PG&E for quite some time around here, and we know what they can be like, and what the impacts of their lack of investment in infrastructure and their responsibility towards their shareholders has really led to. But because we've had so many fires, and a lot of them have been caused by the investor-owned utilities, not just PG&E, but others across the state, I think there's been a bit more of an awakening in the legislature about what those impacts are. In fact, a couple of years ago, the legislature, and in some of these conversations we were having around PG&E, the notion of municipalization of the utility first started to take effect and have some traction. Those have since been dropped, although I still think that is a productive conversation for us to be having, because if in the end the state is going to be backing them to any extent, and the state is going to have to back them to some extent, then why should they get the benefit of making decisions to benefit shareholders and state support if we don't turn them into a state agency? And with the community choice aggregators growing around the state, and especially in Northern California, a lot of the customers, PG&E's current customers, are in areas that are covered by a community choice aggregator, which so the supply side of electricity is being dealt with outside of PG&E, and then they're now responsible for a lot of the transmission lines and other area in sort of other infrastructure that they have had for a long time. So we're already moving the supply of electricity, the acquisition of electricity, to a more municipal-like organization with these joint powers agreements, these community choice aggregators. So why not take that further step? And areas like City of San Jose, Sam Liccardo is very interested in this, in acquiring all of the ability to manage the electrical distribution infrastructure within the City of San Jose. And that's a good conversation to have, although I have warned him that if we end up doing this piecemeal, it's the rural areas like ours that are going to suffer, because we may not of our own be able to independently municipalize sort of what our section is, but because that's a pretty expensive proposition, and San Jose may be able to do that. And so if the areas that can, San Francisco, they've been talking about it, San Jose's been talking about it, I think some of these other larger jurisdictions are, if they do that, then we're going to be left behind with an increased obligation to pay through PG&E for infrastructure. So if we're going to municipalize, we need to be talking about the entire system in a rational way. And that's what I'm very interested in. The governor had been interested in it, although right now I think he's been pretty distracted with a lot of other things that are going on. And so PG&E finally has started to make some of the investments that you frankly have been asking them to do for a long time, like the insulating lines better and doing some of these fast trip systems that shut down a line that is interacting with the environment and be likely to cause a fire with a tree or a branch or some other. But of course, being PG&E, their first implementation really didn't work very well. And we saw a lot of blackouts throughout the valley in times and places where they shouldn't have been. And it was squirrels hitting the lines and other things. And those systems were not adjusted appropriately, is kind of what they say. That's eased a bit because they've gone through and readjusted some of those systems. But I think their implementation leaves a lot to be desired. And the PUC, and I know all of us have had long experience with the PUC, not always very favorable. The PUC, though, does some good things sometimes, and they are holding PG&E, or trying to hold PG&E accountable for that implementation of some of the new technology. So it's been fits and starts. They are starting to make some of those investments appropriately, rather than just going through and cutting trees pell-mell, which is what they've done, which is what they did after the wildfire. And so CAL FIRE and the county have issued notices of violation to them, which are still trying to be resolved, where PG&E, I think, just took advantage of it, hired a bunch of contractors, a lot of contractors from out of state, arborists from out of state, don't know anything about redwood forests, coming and making decisions about what trees need to come down and why. It was really just astonishing. And CAL FIRE was doing a good job holding them accountable for it. And some of the local folks at CAL FIRE were very concerned appropriately. But now it's sort of burbled up in the organization, and I'm just not quite sure. I've written letters to them. I've talked to them, trying to find out what CAL FIRE at the highest ranks are going to do about those notices of violation. But we have yet to get a clear answer. And I will tell you, I'm pretty frustrated with that, because we cannot have an organization like PG&E just rolling rampant through areas like ours and using the wildfire as an excuse to perpetuate the kind of cutting and abuse of the forest that they've been known for around here. So we're going to continue to push on PG&E, but it's pulling teeth in the legislature, because again, the influence that they have and the unwillingness, I think, of legislators, especially in the urban areas, which there are far more urban legislators who just don't see these impacts and haven't worked with an investor-owned utility in these kinds of circumstances. So that those are a little bit difficult. But along that line, one of the things was, oh man, I'm going to have to dig for this. That a question was raised about a Dodd bill, SB 833, and I've seen a little bit of it. I don't know what it's going to happen to it in the Senate as it comes over to the Assembly, but it is intended to provide technical assistance and some grants out to local jurisdictions, so cities and counties, so that they can create standards for themselves about what energy resilience looks like. And from that standpoint, I think that that is a very beneficial thing and could be very helpful for us to be able to define what our energy resilience looks like. And it's also another step potentially to build some more impetus around, or kind of build some cooperation among jurisdictions along the municipalization line. Because I think if we can have the community choice aggregators purchasing power and then have the infrastructure being run and managed by a state agency or by a governmental agency that is not responsible to shareholders, they can be a lot more resilient. They'll be a lot more responsive to us and to the people in these areas. And so I think these are pieces that can ultimately get us to the path. But both of the committees that look at the investor-owned utilities in the Senate and the Assembly have been typically very responsive to what the IOUs want. And I'm not sure what that bill's going to look like really when it gets over to us. But I'll keep an eye on that, and we're going to still see what we can do and what tools we can give locals to be much more grid aware. And on that, there was a question also raised about solar. And solar, the PUC has been looking at an action, and they've stalled it right now, but they will bring it up again. And this is having to do with the solar rates. And it's depending on how it comes down, it is or it isn't a threat to rooftop solar. There was a bill last year, I think it was, in the Assembly where we were trying to take a run at this. So here's the problem. The solar incentives were built into the rates a number of years ago, and it was easier to build them into electrical rates than it was to find external money to then provide some of the solar incentives. And they've been very successful. And we've seen a lot of solar installations penetrating into communities. Ours has a pretty good representation of solar installations. Other communities across California really haven't. But because that incentive is built into the rates, there is a cost shift that is happening. And essentially people who don't have solar are paying those rates, and so benefiting the people who do have solar. I have solar, and so that this cost shift is benefiting people who have made that decision to install solar. Now, when there were few installations, the cost shift wasn't very significant. Currently in California, well, last year when we were looking at this, it's $3 billion annually, and that number is growing. So there's a significant shift of money from people without solar to people with solar. And communities that don't have very much solar penetration, which we're also trying to encourage, are bearing the brunt of that. And because that incentive is for rooftop solar only, then we're not really able to restructure that incentive to modernize what we really need to be looking for if we're going to deal with microgrids. And then back to the Dodd bill, looking for building community resilience and community capacity. Solar is going to be a big part of it, that distributed generation component, but solar without storage doesn't make sense as much moving forward. And it's that solar with storage that gives us that resilience, the ability to develop microgrids, and the ability then to respond when we get those shutdowns from PG&E for their public safety power shutoffs, whatever they're calling them, or storm damage or others. It's that storage component. And so what needs to be looked at is how we rethink the incentives to respect the investments people have made, to give them that return on their investment, which is what that incentive was meant to do, address the cost shift, and then really modernize the incentives to be able to incorporate some of the shifts that need to happen, like storage. And it's either storage at a household or storage in a neighborhood or other ways that we're going to then build that resilience in a local level, so that whatever is happening with the distribution lines, especially as it's going to, I'm assuming, take us quite a while to get PG&E to really do the investments that they ultimately need for power grid reliability, having those other components to this is really what is going to be necessary. So the PUC is going to be looking at that. Unfortunately, the PUC tends to listen more to the IOUs than others, and they've built into this last proposal some things that I think are just ultimately highly objectionable, and things that they've wanted all along. Like, if you have solar, then they want everybody with solar to pay a connection fee just to pay a connection fee. And the fact is that solar operates more like you still have to buy your electricity from PG&E, and then you're selling what's generated on your rooftop to them. And it's in that net offset that the rates ultimately are that's sort of how the rates are structured. And to me, that is just really problematic, because why shouldn't those who have solar be able to use the energy that they're generating, and then if they need more to be able to buy more, and then if we're generating more than we've used locally, how we capture that, keep it local, and use that to build resilience, which means microgrids, or even larger than home by home grid, but maybe neighborhood capacity to withstand fluctuations in the power grid, even in the evening when we're not generating solar, or not generating solar as much because of cloudy days or tree cover or sort of other impacts on solar. So there are better ways to do this. And of course, PG&E just jumped to what the industry was asking them to do. And that's a non-starter. There was a bill, as I'd said, Lorena Gonzalez ran one last year, where we were really having some of those more effective conversations about addressing that cost shift and building some fairness in the rates. Because if what we've done is driving up rates, electricity rates, which is what it's been doing, then it's going to make it harder and harder for us to go to all electric homes, provide incentives for people to remove gas-fired appliances and put in electrical appliances, whether that's stoves or water heaters, dryers, things that had traditionally been gas powered. That's the complexity of what we're trying to do, and an oversimplification of just what it is that the industry or that the utility wants PUC to do is really not the direction that we should be going. So hopefully the PUC is rethinking this based on the public response, and will be more responsive to the sensitivities needed around what the impacts are ultimately on the grid. A couple other things that I want to mention, just because of the questions that were raised. Transportation, the RTC and the rail plan, not to get too much into the whole rail trail thing. But yes, there was a question whether or not the current plans, whatever the RTC does with the rail line, would fit into the California rail plan. And yes, there are allocations that would qualify. Sort of depends on what the implementations are here. But the state, because of the way the transportation grid works and its reliance on fossil fuels, the state is looking very, very seriously at the overall transportation grid, transportation system, and seeing where we can provide better carbon benefit. There's a great program now moving along to electrify Caltrain on the peninsula, which is a good thing. And I wish that the high-speed rail had started with projects like that and sort of built out from there, because they could show the value of what moving people quickly in more congested corridors can be, instead of building what the opponents are deeming a train to nowhere. out in the Central Valley. And if it all connects together, okay. But I think they have a long way to go to show the utility and show really how a system like that can be done. And electrifying Caltrain, where they'll be able to run faster stock, move more people through, and in a cleaner way, is very promising. And that investment, I think, is really where we should be looking as we're looking for rail, in areas where we're moving people, and it is then able to move people out of fossil fuel based vehicles more into congregate types of transportation modes. That is one of the solutions we need to address to deal with mitigating greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector and others. And I know there's a lot of frustration with the bus routes going up and down the valley because of all the congestion that's there. And I don't have easy answers for expanding metro in Santa Cruz County, even though that would be a good thing. And there's a long history to this too, that back in the days of Les White, when he was a general manager at Metro, who understood Washington politics very, very well and was part of building a lot of the transportation bills and funding packages that were going through there, was able to design funding formulas that benefited us. We actually have, given our population, geographic layout, and all that, we have a better transit system than any other similar sized community or community with similar constraints. And a lot of it goes back to Les White writing some of the formulas that we were able to draw down. Now, move to present day, what's happened with that? Well, a lot of the federal formulas have changed, and they have not been investing in transit the way they did. In the Schwarzenegger administration decided, even though he likes to tout himself as this big environmentalist, moving ahead with good policy benefiting the climate, he completely got the state out of investing at all in public transit. So there used to be a state component that was a piece of this, and that is no longer there. And so that structure was taken out of the way the state funded transportation, and getting that back in is very, very difficult, if not impossible, just given the gamut of what other needs that there are. There's a bill this year to move to funds and to push school districts, for example, back into busing kids, which would be a good thing from a climate standpoint. I mean, when you look at our communities where all the kids are being driven and it's one or two in a car and then the parent driving them to our schools, and the school districts couldn't afford buses in the past, and it was very difficult for them to run and manage their fleet. So they sold them off around here. And there still are some buses. I know there's some buses in the San Lorenzo Valley, but the investment that we're trying to look at is reinstill that in school districts, but electrify that fleet, have that an electric fleet, which is very possible to do. And so if we now get the state back into helping us transport kids to and from school and where they need to be, but we do it in a climate beneficial way by making them electric, I think we're now, or using some of these investments in local municipal bus systems like our metro. So it's either school district or it's metro, but moving kids around. And the SLV corridor, I think, is prime for that, because kids tend to move up and down along a fairly well-defined corridor. So there are some really interesting options of rethinking how we address some of the transportation sector and be able to move that forward. So I'm very interested in that proposal and see how we do. And speaking of which, too, the one of Nancy asked a question about Metro, the Highway 17 bus going to the airport. I'm going to continue to bang my head against the wall on that one. We haven't been able to do that, and that's come up and was a priority back when I was on Metro years ago. We were trying to get the ability to move, to have at least some of the Highway 17 buses going to the airport. And because of that, was always blocked by the Valley Transportation Authority and others. And I think, honestly, and I've never gotten a clear answer about this, because this is something that nobody really wants to fess up to. But the city, frankly, I think the city of San Jose likes parking revenues. So they would rather have you driving there. There is one bus out of Santa Clara, the 10, I think, that does go to the airport. But the fact that light rail doesn't go to the airport, and the light rail yard is right across Highway 17 or 880, whatever it is there, from the airport. It's right across the highway from the airport. So there are tracks close by, but it never was designed to go there. And the current BART expansion, which everybody is excited about, and they keep coming to me, well, we need you to support our BART expansion. And I say, well, okay, why isn't BART though going to the airport? There are no plans to send it to the airport. And what would make the most sense is whether or not the Highway 17 bus can have some extensions to the airport. That may or may not make a lot of sense specifically, but that's been asked and blocked from the transit folks over in the Santa Clara Valley. But why from Diridon Station, which is where the Highway 17 bus terminates, why there's not light rail, or why BART doesn't go to the airport from there is just beyond me. And there's really never been a clear answer for that. So it's very difficult for us here, other than in a car or an airport shuttle or something, to get to the airport. I have tried it, and it's just not easy. It's not worth it. But imagine taking the 17 bus to Diridon Station, hopping on light rail or some other facility, getting right to the airport. Just like most major cities I've been to, when we got to just going to Glasgow, we got to the airport, there's a tram that takes you right into downtown Edinburgh. And from there, you can connect with a train to get to Glasgow. Very, very simple, very straightforward. Every European city does that. My daughter's in Portland. I get to her flight. If I fly to Portland, hop on the light rail there, go right into downtown Portland. And the system in San Jose just was never designed to do that, for a whole host of really not helpful reasons. Okay, so the last thing then that I want to address is fires. And I know that's on everybody's mind. And yes, actually there's a lot around fires. There's a bill that I'm helping with right now to invest a lot more money and personnel into fighting fires so that we can move resources where they need to be, when they need to be, to knock down the fires before they get to be big. This is one of the big benefits of the way the fire agencies in the San Lorenzo Valley work, is they get to fires very quickly and knock them down before they become major conflagrations. And that didn't work in San Mateo last year in the seeds of what became the CZU complex fire. There weren't enough resources being brought to bear there. And that fire got out of hand very quickly. Plus, in fairness, I think it did not behave in any way that they thought it was going to behave. And it moved across Big Basin in a day. It got up into the Crowns, moved across Big Basin in one day. Nobody expected a fire like that in a redwood forest to move at that level. But the fact of the matter was, there were a number of major fires going on at the same time, and there just were inadequate resources, manpower at each of them. And part of it's COVID related, because the fire system had always relied on trained prisoners to go out via the hand crews. Well, that couldn't happen because of the pandemic. There were a lot of states that would often send aid. They didn't initially because of the pandemic and the way that the numbers were. They were concerned about coming into California, and frankly, Newsom got on the phone with a lot of those states. And we then fairly quickly, but not quickly enough, had firefighters from as far away as New Jersey coming in. We often get firefighters from Australia and other places. We send assistance to them in their fire season. They send assistance to us in our fire season. Although now, because fire season's virtually year round, those kinds of relationships are going to be much more difficult to do, but we did get assets from there. We've also funded over the last number of years, the California Fire Corps right now, CAL FIRE, has one of the most significant air forces of any firefighting agency in the country, probably in the world, and the ability to draw assets from other places. So those, plus investing in sensors and cameras, in other technologies to spot when fires are starting, and then be able to knock them down quickly are a lot of things that we've been doing. But the manpower question has been a significant question. And we've put money, a lot of money the last few years in, and there's a proposal this year to put money directed at increasing the manpower capacity of CAL FIRE, especially in Northern California, to be able to address a lot of the fires that we've seen. Help for people who have been burned out of their homes or their businesses. A lot of that is through Cal OES and with FEMA. And we had a number of times the FEMA administrator here, the Cal OES administrator here, looking at what the needs were to try and assure that we're getting the assistance out. And my staff, frankly, is still dealing with calls from people looking for assistance and help, and we're trying to connect them in. But the county did a pretty good job of setting that stage and being the central point for directing people to assistance. And I know, and we're struggling with Cal OES and others on places like Last Chance Road and others looking at sort of aftermath, but really working to try and make sure that we're bringing the resources in to help people recover, to get homes rebuilt, to try and let people, I don't know how you get back to a normal life after that, but as much back to normal as possible, and provide some of those resources. So there's a lot going on, we know. And because the good news, bad news of the number of fires and the extent was that one of the only silver linings there is that it's more than just legislators who come out of these rural areas that are subject to fires that are paying attention to these issues and realizing how significant these issues really are to people across California. What we had previously thought is the urban wildland interface is now much more of California than we had realized. And so where development has been happening, where fire resources had been, where response had been, is now threatening much more urbanized areas than it had been in the past. And that, as I say, not that there's anything good about any of that, other than the awareness now in the legislature is making it a lot easier to push for policies, make some of the changes that we need to, and ultimately make some of the investments that need to be made, whether it's manpower, technology, any of that, to get that capacity built up, really reinstated from a CAL FIRE standpoint. All right, so I have probably, oh Lord, bored you all to tears so far on all this. I know I see there are a lot of questions. Roger, are you gonna sort of lead that, or somebody gonna lead the questions? Because I'd like to be able to answer what's on people's minds.
Invite people to raise their hands.
So, hang on just a moment.
There's an echo.
Mark, I'm happy to jump in while they're fixing that, because I've been supporting them with monitoring the chat and just kind of let you know what came through while you were talking.
Sure.
Let's see, let me scan on up there. I think there was a question about what your thoughts are on Romero Institute Green New Deal. If you're seeing support for that in the legislature.
Well, the Green New Deal is actually an interesting one, because if you look at how that started, especially in Congress, a lot of those concepts were things that California had been working on. So from our standpoint, the Green New Deal is a lot of business as usual, although I have to caveat that with, I think we've lost some of the thread of where we could have been making some of the investments. And again, with the speaker pointing out that California is not necessarily leading from a climate standpoint anymore, where I think we're falling short is a lack of action and no lack of talk. We generate a lot of hot air, which is probably adding to global warming as politicians, but not always a lot of talk. And part of what the Green New Deal was some of these investments in communities and that allow communities to build that resilience and really take care of themselves. And those are some of the parts I don't think we've done a great job of, but there are some policies now moving through the legislature that can address that. So hopefully I always hope we can be a bit of a beacon for what Green New Deal could look like. And we should be from California, because we generally have the political will, and places like Santa Cruz, we live in a glorious place with a political will that doesn't exist across California, unfortunately. And so the examples that we can provide from here, and the accountability and the direction we can provide from here are really some good models for moving forward. So I'm still hopeful California can kind of show the way with what the Green New Deal really stands for in a number of its components.
So I've got the chat that I'll go ahead and read to you.
Okay.
And we've got about 10 questions. So we thought that we would just go ahead and identify the poster and their location and what they asked. So Jen Morgan in Boulder Creek asked about the role of technological innovations and what they play in addressing climate change and becoming an alternative means for economic gain.
Yeah, the future direction for dealing with the climate crisis is all about technology and innovation. And that's where we need to be thinking about investments, and because we can be talking about how we manage working lands, as I had mentioned before, or even natural lands, and rethink what those managements look like. And there are significant carbon benefits from that, both storing and managing carbon. And if you think about organic farming is all about carbon in the soil. And Santa Cruz right now has about 30% of its ag land in organics. The state has a goal of maybe 10%, which just is far short of really where we should be. So those kinds of concepts and innovations are really what we need to be looking at. In fact, CSUMB has an agricultural initiative that's really looking specifically at technology in that sector. But then let's go to transportation, right? Let's go to grid management. Let's go to electrification. A lot of those technologies exist, but the efficiencies ultimately are going to come out of the kind of next steps in how we manage. A smart home these days will be able to track its electricity usage. You'll be able to find out fairly quickly where energy is being wasted, because it's an important I can't underscore this more. It's not just about generating locally and generating electricity in a clean way. It's about reducing the amount of electricity we use overall. Because if we aren't energy smart, then we're going to be taxing the grid so significantly that we're not going to ultimately see the climate benefits. But if we reduce our energy usage and ensure that our energy sources are green, that's where we really get bang for the buck.
Thank you. Jen also had another question about whether the oil industry recognizes its product is finite and depleting.
No, they don't. They in fact, there are a number of industries who don't seem to subscribe to this notion of science. And anytime that gets brought up, they completely deny it. And so they've blocked most every attempt for us to really push on them and change that business model. Now, there are some of us, I will admit, who would like to see that whole sector go out of business, but it is complicated, and we're bearing the cost of it. I mean, the way they've structured so offshore drilling, for example, there are a lot of wells because those oil fields are being depleted. They're not, from what I know, new oil wells going in, at least in state waters. But as those oil reserves are being depleted, the way they've set up their companies is the last company owning it just goes bankrupt and walks away. So not only have they created all of this environmental harm, made a tremendous amount of money on this, we're all now on the hook to clean up those structures. Makes absolutely no sense, but it's been very, very difficult to do anything about it. So no, they're living in an archaic world that they're desperately trying to hold on to. And the more they write checks into the political realm, the more they get to hold on to it.
Thank you. Larry Ray asked a question about the Green New Deal, which I believe you just addressed. And also
Sally.
wanted to talk about, hear some about the coastal wetlands are being affected by sea level rises.
Yeah.
What are we doing in California about that?
Oof. So California's lost 80+% of its wetlands, its coastal wetlands over the years. And a lot of that is not recoverable. And then when you think about sea level rise, so coastal wetlands are the natural systems that are the buffers against sea level rise. And it's created some significant areas. So if you go up, case in point, San Francisco Bay, there's some very significant wetlands there and a lot of places where the bay is very shallow. And if those systems were able to work the way that they're supposed to work, as the seas rise, right, those wetlands would move as necessary. But a lot of behind the wetlands has been hardened with roads, with infrastructure, with walls and things. So those wetlands have no place to go. So they'll buffer for a little while, but at some point they won't be a buffer anymore. And then what? So the more we've taken out wetlands, the more that we're vulnerable to some of these changes. The Monterey Bay now, these amazing dune systems that we have around the Monterey Bay, those are buffers against sea level rise and some of those changes, but we keep wanting to take them down, to build on them, it's been really frustrating. I remember when I was on Coastal Commission, some projects in Southern California, they wanted to build in wetlands. And in order to do that, they had to build these long and extensive levees and dikes to protect what this new development would be. And they were really frustrated. The developers were really frustrated when I said, that makes absolutely no sense. Why do we have to build where we're taking away from us our ability to have the resilience necessary to address the issues that we know are coming? And then you're having to put in all these structures, expensive structures, difficult to maintain, that aren't necessarily going to survive. But the developers love green fields and they love filling in wetlands. It's just sort of the way it's always been. Instead of rethinking where we're putting housing, that's just kind of been the structure. So the Elkhorn Slough, there's recently been some projects where they have purchased back some of the land that had been wetlands and had been used by dairy farmers.
Right.
And they have recontoured it and developed it. And part of it's an experiment to see how we do a better job of restoring wetlands. And oh my gosh, when you see what's going on down there and the growth and the expanse of how that area is recovering, it's just really astonishing. They built in channels, they built in movements, and it's going to manage itself over time. Really exciting to see. Plus, I've been a part of, I was traipsing around in the mud planting oysters out there, trying to get the Pacific oysters back into the Elkhorn Slough the way that they had been before. What huge water quality benefits, as well as biodiversity and other natural species. So Elkhorn Slough is a case in point where we've lost a lot of wetlands, but over time, but now starting to put back some wetlands. But yeah, wetlands are our natural buffer, and the more we mess with them, the more we're going to be in trouble.
There was a question from Beverly Deschaux about rooftop solar versus cost shifting. And I know you addressed it some,
Yeah.
but she's making a point of cost shifting, not adding value, not adding to solar values.
Well, the cost shift is a significant issue, and it wasn't in the beginning, but it really is now. And I know there's been debate about whether there is or isn't, but every study that's been done and all the investigations from ratepayer advocates and others really show what the impact is. The more penetration we get into underserved communities, the less of a sort of economic justice issue it has been, but it really is stark when you look at where we've had solar penetrations. So the cost shift is something that we need to address, but it's how we address it. And what I don't want to see is that we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? That we are not protecting the incentives that we put in place. So where the solar incentives have been a remarkable success. And this is really where government can be effective and has driven markets. Because of that incentive, and to the extent more people have installed solar, that's brought down the cost of panels. It's made solar installations cheaper. Yeah, we've had to pass a number of policies to facilitate the planning process and the things that people have to go through to put solar on their roof, to make that easier for people to do. So all those things are really good things. I want to see us now also go into the storage area. And it's difficult for those of us who have already installed solar to shift and install storage. And if we could shift those incentives to provide incentives to not just put on solar, rooftop solar, but also build in storage, and then build microgrids, neighborhood microgrids or individual microgrids, that's really our future of resilience and sort of independence. And this is why some of the policies that we're looking at for allowing communities, giving communities the help to do their own resilience studies, get some technical assistance, get some grants to be able to do this, then communities can decide for themselves really what that looks like. So there are a lot of homes, for example, in the San Lorenzo Valley that are subject to tree cover that solar may not make sense. A lot of places in Santa Cruz County where solar makes a tremendous amount of sense. How do we design a grid where we build that benefit and that resilience that then helps people without the solar on their property, on their rooftop, that can take advantage of the solar that's being generated locally by neighbors, and then be able to share that across locally. Those kinds of things really are ultimately the future of the grids. And then, God forbid, whatever PG&E does with its power lines and its transmission and shuts down because they're afraid of wind or whatever, right? We're less affected by it. I don't want to see people buying generators because of these shutdowns. We need to build other types of storage utilizing the solar capacity that we have. That's the resilience. That's some of the conversations that we ultimately need to have. And that's why this shift of looking at an incentive that's been very effective and useful to this point, but how do we now recast that incentive to be beneficial towards how we need to be designing the grids locally? I've always been a fan of distributed generation, local generation. I think that is ultimately critical to us. But just generation without storage is not going to be able to let us build the microgrids.
Larry Ray offers a compliment on all the work that's been done with the overzealous tree cutting with PG&E. And rumor control, he's asking, PG&E has been rumored to do a lot more tree cutting along the transmission lines. So he's asking, is there any oversight around the company being more responsible in their vegetation management?
Yes, so that's the notice of violations that CAL FIRE has issued and the county has issued. They were very aggressive, and I've been to some of these places where they just cut these huge swaths in the forest. And they don't even do a good job, as you all know, building water bars and other kinds of defenses because when you denude an area of its vegetation, it's much more subject to erosion, and especially sort of young geologic areas like ours that are built on a lot of sand, there are a lot of impacts to not doing it right. Well, they've done a lot of cutting and not having done it right. When Case in point, when they're bringing in arborists from around the country and arborists who've never seen a redwood tree, how are they making good decisions about what trees need to come down from a safety standpoint, if they even need to come down from a safety standpoint, and what don't? So I think that PG&E was probably gleefully overcutting because they use the disaster as an opportunity to come in and do things that we have been for years putting a rein on them so that they're not overcutting. They're not, and we had been, back when I was on the board, we had all these community meetings and we got the county. And so when PG&E came in and wanted to do some of the vegetation management for their lines, they had to come to the county and show the plans and get that approved. And we were able to have those explained to the community about what was happening and why, and got community input rather than just coming in. So they did a lot of that, and Coastal Commission, the county, and CAL FIRE have all been going after them. And that's where, unfortunately, a lot of that has not resulted in much yet. Those are still outstanding notices of violation that need resolution.
Tammy Stolzenhaler is asking about improved fire response on both a local and state level in the upcoming years.
So yeah, and that's what I tried to talk about before, that over the years, the legislature has put, the last couple of years anyway, we put a lot of money into CAL FIRE, and it's increasing technology, it's increasing the Air Force that they have now so that they have more assets. But we were kind of caught with an archaic structure, the fact that they were relying so much on these prison workforces, inmate workforces, to be the hand crews. And I talked to a lot of the crews down here. We had crews from all over the state during the CZU fire. And where a lot of these wildland crews would normally come in and be the technical experts and do the engineering and do the planning, they were having to do the handwork because there weren't crews here to do the handwork. So there's Senator McGuire is doing a bill that I'm working with him on to expand. We're trying to invest in people and in human type resources, not just the technology and the aircraft and the equipment, but ensuring that we have more people on the ground and year round. I remember the days, not very long ago, it was only a couple of years ago, but the fire season didn't exist in the winter, and CAL FIRE didn't staff, even here in the San Lorenzo Valley, didn't staff the CAL FIRE stations in the wintertime because they just weren't needed. Well, that's just not true anymore. You know, Big Sur burned a couple of weeks ago in the middle of winter. We're seeing a hot spell right now. Hopefully we don't get fire started now, but our season now is year round. And so shifting the management of resources, the number of people available, and getting that workforce up to speed so that we can get people to the increasing number of fires quickly and knock them down before they become conflagrations is really what we've been trying to do. And no matter how much money we put in every year, we're kind of astonished at what we thought were adequate resources weren't adequate resources. We just kind of feel like we're constantly a little bit behind, but there's a huge push now, and especially Northern California. These are where McGuire is a senator for the North Coast, and he's experienced a lot of wildfires in his district up there. So he's a perfect person to be running this. And there's a big budget ask and a policy bill that addresses capacity that we're definitely trying to put in place.
Mark, related to this, I'm going to jump down to a recent question from Mark Lee about how we balance the requirements for rural area fire mitigation, like house hardening under Senate Bill 423. And there, Mark has a concern that much of these strategies are very expensive for rural inhabitants, introduced by our urban senators from SoCal.
Yeah, and that's always going to be an interplay. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, just harden your home. But remember, here in Santa Cruz County, we adopted years ago the urban wildland interface. So any new construction or any other sort of construction that's going on needs to take into account, and there's simple things you can do, right? Close off eaves. Don't have open things under your deck. appropriate setbacks. And there are monies available for being able to do some of that. The water storage requirements are pretty big in some of these areas, especially where there's not other water that's available on some of these properties. But that's going to be difference between life and death sometimes, or the ability to save a structure or not save a structure. So we are constantly trying to ensure that we are sensitive to the requirements that are being put in place, but also where some of these requirements make sense, which a lot of them do, that there's some funding that homeowners can apply for to help mitigate ultimately the expense of it. But in the end, we want homeowners to be designing, building, thinking about what would make their structure safer. And when you talk to the firefighters, the local ones, well, less so the local ones, because they know you all really well and they're going to be a little bit more careful, but especially CAL FIRE. If there are structures, and there are constant stories about this during the CZU fire, there were structures that they just couldn't worry about because there wasn't anything they could do. And there were structures where the property owner had done a lot of work and they were a lot happier. Sometimes all they needed to do was enhance a fire break, build a little bit of a trench around it to kind of stop the ground fire. So once the fire had burned through a big basin, it went back down onto the ground and was advancing along the ground where it moves a little bit more slowly. And oftentimes they just need to build a berm, build a trench, kind of disturb the soil there, and it will stop that fire from moving. That's a lot easier to do where a homeowner has taken some of the steps already to protect their house. Because especially when there's, well, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, yes, we were resource constrained with the CZU fire, especially in the beginning. But even when there are adequate boots on the ground to try and do that, there's only so much that the firefighters can do. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to do what we can do. And then, yeah, we're trying to make sure that those requirements make sense and that where necessary, we can also help those homeowners be able to make the investments necessary.
Related to that, Nancy Macy asks about expanding aerial resources, especially helicopters, fixed wing planes, for a faster response.
Well, those, yeah, a lot of that's already really in place. It was the CZU fire was difficult from that standpoint because it blew up so fast that there were air assets coming over every day, but because of the smoke, they didn't know where they were supposed to go. And so it kind of depends sometimes on how the fire is developing. There are a tremendous amount of air assets that are kept around Sacramento. And if you think about helicopters or aircraft, that's not very far away. They can move very quickly. And they have firefighting assets staged in various places. And again, California has the largest firefighting air force in the country, probably in the world. And when, on a per capita or sort of on the basis of where, what the potential really is. And then we still even bring in more assets from as far away as Australia when it's necessary, when our assets are really on the brink. So the resources aren't the problem. It's identifying where they need to go, how to communicate on the ground. And that's where there have been a lot of investments lately with CAL FIRE in technologies and other things to be able to help direct the aircraft to get where they need to go. And I can't underscore enough that a lot of this depends on being able to get to these fires as they develop very quickly and knock them down before they start to become so big or generating so much smoke that from the air, pilots have no idea. They can't see where they're dropping, and where they can't see where they're dropping, they will not drop.
Here's a good Jeopardy question from Allison Anderson. Where did all the logs go? Do you know?
Actually, I don't. And this was a real piece of contention because PG&E using every excuse possible to not do their job. And they left logs, they left them in the wrong places. They were just really difficult to deal with. But they then tried to turn this on the county and says, you have to tell us where we can put the logs. And I'm not sure what the resolution was, but the county helped sort of PG&E and then the other responders who were helping to move some of these equipment around, because it's not you can't just take them anywhere, but that was a real question early on. Where do the logs go? So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that directly, but it just another thing that PG&E said, okay, yeah, we will help. And then they didn't. And they just had another excuse. Well, we don't know where to take these because it's the county's fault. Everything's the county. Everything with them is somebody else's fault. They're like a 3-year-old, right? Everything is always somebody else's fault. Okay. But logs were being moved, had to get addressed, but I'm not honestly sure where they went.
There was a question about CARB and who might be our local submitter for grants for electric buses.
Well, that would be the Metro District, ultimately. And Metro has some pretty aggressive plans for electrifying a lot of their routes. And even one that amuses me is the 17 route. Because I've seen them, they've run buses over 17 empty and they don't go very fast uphill. Although I talked to the bus manufacturers and they say that they are working on that. Of course, it'll charge somewhat going downhill. But if you think about a defined route like that, you can have charging capacity at both ends. The other thing we're working on too is time of charging. It's obviously cheaper to be charging at night or when the demand is not as great. But when you're running a bus system, you can't really be charging electrical rates with that same mode. So we've been trying to get the PUC to look at how they restructure that to benefit decisions being made by like Metro and wanting to run buses. But if they can charge at Dearden, they can charge in Santa Cruz, and as long as it can carry a full load of passengers up that hill, that's a great route because it's finite. It's not really that long. That would be a great facility to electrify. But yeah, it'd be Metro that is making those applications, and I know they're very interested in electrifying as much of their fleet as they can.
Thank you. There are a number of chat back and forths responding to your recent comments, but I will skip ahead to, and there are some compliments too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's always nice.
Do you have any updates about the water situation in upper San Lorenzo Valley? And I'm personally saying thank you to you for all the assistance you've been giving the residents up there.
Well, thank you. I don't know. That's really more of a local. Sometimes I know what I read in the papers about kind of what's happening here, but something that I care about. I know that area. I know that system pretty well, having dealt with it in the past. But honestly, I don't have an update. I'm not sure where that stands.
Is Metro responsible for school buses?
No, Metro's not responsible for school buses. And in fact, there's some federal legislation that prohibits them from running school buses. I don't know why. And in some areas that you can do that, but no, Metro does provide essentially school transportation to the extent. And when I was on Metro, we were always trying to design schedules for the buses we knew that kids took to and from schools around bell schedules. So when the schools would identify their bell schedules, there could be some adjustment to Metro's routes and the timing of those routes to accommodate that. Although the process for doing that is not quite that simple and has implications across the entire system. So it's difficult for Metro to respond to changes in the bell schedule. So the more consistent the bell schedules from the schools are year to year, the easier it is for Metro to design routes to do that. So they're very sensitive to the fact that there are kids riding Metro buses to and from school, but they're not technically providing school transportation.
Mark Lee is asking, what do we do with the PUC? They appear to be siding with the monopolization aspirations of the 4 largest private utilities in California.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. We fought that when we were trying to deal with the water situation here in Felton, and even getting audiences with the commissioners was very difficult to do. As a county supervisor, it was very hard to do. my in there recently has been Martha Guzman Aceves, who's now left, unfortunately. So she was always my back channel to finding out what's going on and be able to get some responses and get a sense of what's going on. And I'm gonna have to rethink that because she just left recently, and that's unfortunate. Some of the new commissioners talk a better line, but when you think about how that structure happens, the interactions that they have with the IOUs are far more regular than they do with others. And so with the organizations like the Office of Ratepayer Advocates and other that provide some of that pushback or the ability to rally and have community pushback, they're not always hearing what they need to hear. And for us to, very difficult for the legislature to change that. The legislature is not fond at all of the PUC in a lot of the ways that they function. And they're all gubernatorial appointments. The governors seem to love that and love to control it. It's very hard for the legislature to break into it. One thing that I would like to see, and I'm dead serious about this, and they hate it, is they should move back to Sacramento. They're kind of in their own little world in San Francisco. And the reason that they were moved to San Francisco was to get them away from the railroads, because that was their original charge was the railroads. Well, doesn't exist anymore. And they're kind of in their own, sometimes their own ivory tower in Sacramento, and some of the commissioners will deal with the legislature. I mean, Martha was great. She came out of the administration. I had a long standing relationship with her, and we knew how to talk. Some of the other ones I can reach out to, I don't always hear back from. And if they were a little closer to Sacramento and a little more accessible to the legislature, I think we could change a lot of that perspective and that attitude that has been very destructive. But I know we all want to think of them as the Public Utilities Commission, but they see themselves as the Public Utilities Commission. They're beholden to the utilities, and that's kind of the source of the frustration. There have been some very good members that have been put on from time to time, but the ones that have spoken out against the IOUs, and that's true whether it's in the energy sector or the water sector or others, don't always last very long. I remember Loretta Lynch was a great commissioner and very outspoken. And because of that, she got yanked. She wasn't on there for very long, but she's still doing a lot of that work. I see her from time to time and relying on her expertise and what she learned over the years and what she learned about how they work. She's been a tremendous asset as we're trying to sort through what they're doing and why. I've actually run bills to try and open up communications with them, make some of their findings, sort of a lot of what their processes do, more available to the public and subject to public search. But those they're not successful. It's a tough nut to crack.
All right. I think Faye Johnson had, Faye, did you have your hand up? Is there something you wanted to bring to Mark?
If so, unmute. Well, while Faye is doing that, Mark, we'll go back to. Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Faye.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay. I thought we saw your hand up.
You
I don't want to miss anybody.
My question.
Mark, there was a question about the railroads.
Okay.
What is the state looking to do to preserve our railroad line from Watsonville to Davenport to Felton? And it's a current topic right now.
Yeah. Well, there's really not a role for the state. This is all governed by federal rules, federal laws that for hundreds of years, well, a couple hundred years, have been very protective of railroads, especially railroad freight service. And that's what I know the issue is. And one of the things that Roaring Camp is very concerned about is if they lose their freight trackage obligation. So every line of track has a common carrier obligation, and that's freight. That if it is, and that common carrier obligation exists on every rail line unless it's been rail banked or it's been taken off. And I know what the concern that Roaring Camp has is that if their section ends up getting rail banked or having that common carrier obligation removed, then they lose leverage to be able to protect their business going on into the future. That's really what's at stake. Now, just rail banking a line, meaning removing that common carrier obligation, doesn't necessarily mean that freight can't run. It means you can run passenger. There are other things that you can remove. But I know Roaring Camp is really concerned about that because they're feeling like they're a bit of a pawn in all of this greenway back and forth sort of fight that's going on. And, you know, it's been, when we acquired, I was a significant part of acquiring that line in the first place. And we made promises to appropriately to Roaring Camp because they're a significant player and an incredible asset for the San Lorenzo Valley, and anything that's a threat to them, I always took very seriously, and we should. And there were some promises made through that process, and I would not want to see those promises broken to ensure that Roaring Camp can continue to do what they do. And yeah, run the beach train. Right now, they're kind of isolated because of the state of the trestles. They couldn't move a new locomotive in, for example. Whether or not they can move rail stock in, I'm not sure, but moving locomotives over those trestles is probably a pretty risky business, at least from what I understand. But that isolation notwithstanding, their ability to continue to operate along those sections that are theirs and then that are currently owned by the RTC is a real question. But that is RTC, who is the owner of the rail line, and they're managing the federal rules that are there. The state doesn't really have a role.
Okay, state doesn't have a role, so that's interesting to know. You know, there's always, you know, talking to somebody because you're well known and respected. So
Well, I will tell you, I care.
yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah,
We
no,
understand that.
absolutely. Good Lord.
If anyone else has, I want to assure you that all your comments are being recorded and copied and pasted. And if you want Mark to respond directly to you, if we haven't addressed something, please put your email contact in here along with your name. And I wanted to make sure that there are quite a few people out there who haven't had a chance to offer a question or a comment. And so if you want to raise your hand, if there's something you wanted to say or make a comment on, otherwise we can let Mark get off a little bit early for the rest of his day and give our thanks to people.
So I want to end with one comment from one of our participants. It says, "Thanks, Mark, for all you do for us, including making yourself available to us and our hard questions. Thanks for all of the great info that you've provided and that you've presented here."
Well, that sums it up.
I've been
really
dealing with
well.
your hard questions since what, 2003?
Yes.
So I, you know, you guys are home for me. This is kind of whatever good, bad, anything that's happened here. You're kind of I was thinking you as family and base and all. So a lot of what I do, I know I'm going to have to answer to you, all of you, and it helps provide some guidance and some perspective. I think some of the worst legislators get kind of lost in the bubble that is Sacramento, and to not be grounded and have some people like you all here. And I haven't, it's hard for me to see everybody, but a lot of the faces that I see in the names here, I've known for years, and that's great.
We do have one more hand up, Mark.
Okay.
It looks like it'll be the last one. Larry Ray, who is from Scotts Valley, by the way. I think that got left out.
Okay.
Has a question for you. Go ahead. Go ahead, Larry. We should be able to hear you. Regenerative ag, that question, is that what we missed? Oh, he
He has-
doesn't, sorry,
Does microphone, yeah.
that is, okay, so regenerative agriculture in the chat. Can anybody pull that up quickly, more quickly than I can? I'm looking for it. Okay, so it's above that. A lot of great questions and comments in here, you guys. I want to assure you that they're all being copied, so you know, they're going to be, Mark will have another chance to respond. Boy, I don't see it. Was it way at the beginning?
I don't know, Larry, that it came through on the chat. If you resend it again, we'll definitely be able to document it.
I think I may have found it, you guys. It looks like, what support do you see in the legislature with respect to regenerative carbon sink agriculture?
Okay, so yeah, that's the whole topic about working lands and natural lands and how we rethink what our investments are. So organics, as I said, is really all about carbon in the soil. And if you sort of understanding how some of these natural processes work, where we're managing the carbon in the soil, the carbon in the plants, and being respectful of how those systems are used, they can provide tremendous carbon benefit. And I've raised this in the cap and trade conversation for a number of years, but it wasn't very well received until fairly recently. And the California Air Resources Board and the administration now have components in the cap and trade expenditures for healthy soils initiatives, as we call them, and others. And I think that definitely needs to be expanded to really think about how we manage and protect working lands in a carbon-friendly way, where those lands are able to hold carbon and to manage carbon, and then that carbon is kind of reintroduced and really protected within that cycle, rather than being utilized with some organic or some agricultural practices where that carbon then ultimately gets released. And so it's forest management, it's wetlands management, it's working lands management, and the investments that we're really missing are to push into those arenas. So it's definitely a conversation, a part of the conversation. I think it's a very important part of the conversation, because I think the benefits from managing land more appropriately can be absolutely huge for some of the least amount of investments if we were just willing to make them.
Yeah, that's really the way it is. Roy Melander has his hand up, and he and Larry were the first two people to arrive at just after 12:30 today. So we've got to give Roy a chance to bring up his comment, and I think he'll be the last one. So Roy, can you talk? Okay, he's ready. Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay. So given this is an environmental discussion, maybe in the future we could always have a trash impact, because how we deal with trash and how we what we put in, take out, and move around definitely has an impact on our local environment. And the other thing would be fisheries are a good source or a touchstone to see how we're really doing on the environment. To monitor what's going on in our wildlife. And I was just reading some old history books, and the amount of wildlife and fishes that used to be here, we don't fully appreciate. And we should always have that as a touchstone.
Yeah, and I completely agree. So on both of those, trash management, sort of the waste sector is long been issues that we've been trying to work on. And you'll notice that even in Santa Cruz County now, there was a bill passed last year that requires waste haulers to collect organics. and not just yard waste, but now food waste and others, and be able to process that, because food waste has been a very significant form of organic input into the waste stream. And we've been trying to get organics really taken out, because then that's a much more effective way of managing it. And those organics in landfills and in other places generate methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. So we've definitely been trying to work and shift how we manage the waste stream. A lot of efforts, unfortunately unsuccessful, around plastics. Plastics are a big part of the waste stream. And I could not agree with you more about fisheries. And you mentioned the word monitoring. One of my bugaboos here is to try and increase the amount of monitoring. Monitoring's not sexy. Monitoring's not always the investments that some of these agencies want to be making. But if we're not monitoring what's happening with the fisheries, with water quality, water movement, we're not monitoring, then we have no idea whether or not what we do is beneficial. And now, as we're learning, like the salmonids, for example, we've been trying to restore individual watersheds, but as it turns out, with like these coastal watersheds that will sometimes naturally have either wildfire or mud flow events and things that close them off, the salmonids kind of know how to move to the next watershed when necessary. And so there's evidence that they are a little bit more adaptable than we had addressed them before, which is making us rethink how we do some of this watershed management and approach more regionally. But again, if we're not then monitoring fish returns, water qualities, and some of those impacts in these watersheds, we don't really have the baseline for knowing what's successful, what's not. And one watershed may be depleted of salmonids one year, and they come back the next year because the fish are making some different decisions based on water conditions. It's actually kind of cool, but if we don't understand some of this stuff, then we're not making some of the right investments in how we're managing watersheds. So yeah, I completely agree with you. And I see that on Ocean Protection Council, but also we're constantly talking about fisheries and the health of fisheries on the Joint Committee for Fisheries and Aquaculture.
It sounds like you've got your finger in a lot of pies there, Mark. And we're appreciative because you're a good cook. I'm going to have to call an end to the meeting, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming and making this environmental town hall a lot of fun, very interesting, great questions, and your willingness to deal with Zoom is so helpful. And we will make this recording available as soon as we get it back. And I am honored and proud to have been able to help provide this. I have a bunch of people to thank for having made this possible. And we have an extraordinary group in the Valley Women's Club working on things for our Valley. And it's really an honor to be a part of that. So thank you, Mark, so much. And thanks to your staff, including Maureen right there. We're grateful you were here. And ladies and gentlemen, go out, be safe, and enjoy the sunshine while you can. Maybe we'll get some rain. Hey, take care. Thank you, Mark. Bye, everybody.